All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're going to talk specifically about how the program relates to the immune system and dealing, especially with like chronic infection or helping to deal with novel infections. And we will talk about beans and iron a little bit too, and how that kind of plays into this as well. But just a little bit about my whole path to figuring all of this stuff out was that it wasn't until after I started quote unquote living a healthy lifestyle that chronic infection became a real problem for me, and that was majorly influenced by the fact that I was supplementing in really awful ways that were dramatically impacting not only my immune function but my hormones and all the different minerals and all the different regulatory functions in my body. And so, what I've come to realize is that I may have overdone that starting about 10, 12 years ago. But the reality is that most of us are born into it. So, for example, with our first son, we thought we were being just smart, and Rachel took a multivitamin. That multivitamin contained zinc and iron and beta carotene and retinol palmitate and a whole bunch of other stuff. And those were in forms that were not necessarily biocompatible. And when you take them in such high concentrated amounts, they dramatically affect your body's ability to metabolize other nutrients. And one of the critical ones, especially when it comes to our immune system, is iron. And the other one that plays a really important role in whether or not we succumb to chronic infection is calcium. And so that's when we start talking about vitamin D. And that was one of the things that I was pounded into my head for years and years, was that you can only take not enough vitamin D. Like literally, you can't take too much. And the more you take, the better you're going to feel. So we're going to talk about the problems with both of these approaches. And so, most of you, it's very likely that your mother probably took a multivitamin, and if not, probably took an iron supplement when they were pregnant, or at least ate fortified foods. And those would have been fortified with iron. So if you guys read the article, you might have seen the video where you can dissolve Cheerios and the iron in there will be attracted to a magnet because it's iron. And it's the same iron that you would use to make a cast iron skillet. It's really not any difference there. And this goes back to why we don't use pink salt, because pink salt contains that same iron, metallic iron. And when that becomes dysregulated in the body, iron starts to accumulate. This is called free iron or unbound iron. And infections, especially bacteria, are very well adapted to competing for that iron in our bodies. And so when our bodies are not properly regulating the iron, it's building up in places in excess where it shouldn't be. Bacteria is going to be sucking that stuff up. And so this is where people who have been struggling with candida for years and years and years, or chronic bronchitis, or chronic Lyme, like I had, start to see, oh my gosh, I was doing everything right, taking all the supplements, eating all of my dark leafy greens, eating lots of beans, right? All the things that we're supposed to be doing to be healthy, and just exacerbating our body's inability to properly regulate the iron. And so the main triad that we're concerned with here is zinc, iron, and copper. And so why are we waking up in the morning and drinking orange juice? Because it's complete vitamin C. It's bioavailable copper. And so early research on iron metabolism said, oh, vitamin C helps increase iron levels in the blood. But they were looking at complete whole vitamin C. And then vitamin C became citric acid, ascorbic acid, a different ascorbate minerals, which are not complete and do not contain the copper. And so when we start ingesting those, so I don't know how many of you, I mean, I was a child of the 80s, so I grew up drinking High C and Sunny Delight, and those all contain synthetic, quote unquote, vitamin C. And as soon as that stuff enters our body, it starts scavenging to complete itself, to become an ascorbate. And it's going to suck up any copper it can find. So now we have kind of a complete picture of what we have been doing as a culture, as a society, in the name of furthering health that has actually been quite detrimental. Fortifying foods with iron, taking supplements with zinc and iron, and using synthetic, incomplete vitamin C. So I was born into that situation and grew up with that. And so it was no surprise that as I approached early childhood, I was dealing with all of the signs and symptoms of chronic infection, really bad cystic acne, chronic ear infections, chronic stomach aches, chronic sore throats, all that stuff. And we're seeing that extremely prevalent today, even with people who are, quote unquote, doing it right. Because we're making a lot of the same mistakes and sometimes even making them in a worse way than people who don't give a crap about their diet. So we have that triad: zinc, iron, and copper. This is why we drink the orange juice first thing in the morning. So immediately we saturate our system with whole vitamin C and the bioavailable copper, and any iron that has started releasing from our system overnight, we're going to hopefully prevent that from being reabsorbed. So we drink the orange juice away from sources of iron. We do that first thing in the morning. We don't have it with a steak or with beans or with green juice, so that there's no iron to bind with some of the vitamin C in there. And that will help shuttle it out of our bodies. And we also include in there other sources of minerals. So we have the coconut water, and some of us might use the pH adjust minerals or baking soda or potassium in the form of cream of tartar. And so those are all ways to saturate the orange juice and prevent that from reacting before it gets into our system. Plus it replenishes all those minerals. And then as we go through the day, right, we are being careful about trying to reincorporate dairy. And one of the main functions of that dairy is that it provides lactoferrin. And so this is absolutely critical, because anytime somebody tries to say to you, oh, dairy causes inflammation, right? Dairy, causes acidity in the body. And we have to say, okay, so you're going to tell me that, after millions of years of evolution, that we are at the peak, the pinnacle of mammalian evolution, that we messed up and made milk, this stuff that creates acidic, mucus, disease-ridden state in the body. I just don't think that would be the case. We would have already selected out for needing milk if that was really what was happening. And in fact, the opposite is true. Lactoferrin, when the baby is first born, is the primary immune system for that baby. Colostrum has exponentially higher amounts of lactoferrin than regular milk. And that lactoferin's first job is to bind with the excess iron that the baby cannot properly absorb and convert into hemoglobin. And now we can follow that chain. What dictates how much iron is going to get turned into hemoglobin? Well, that is a copper-dependent function. It starts with ceruloplasmin, which is a copper-bound enzyme. And that copper is necessary for activating and regulating ferritin. So it's called a peroxidase enzyme. It's critical in regulating our iron metabolism. So let's put this all into perspective. Your mother was taking iron supplements and zinc supplements, and her ceruloplasmin and her ferritin and all those regulatory enzymes are now just completely out of whack. How do you think that's going to affect you? We're born into it. So we get to clean up the mess. And luckily I get to teach my mom how to clean up the mess too, that I was born into. But this is the reality of what we're seeing. And we're seeing is that neurological diseases are inextricably bound to iron dysregulation. And excessive free iron built up in the nervous system and in the brain is the common link in neurodegenerative diseases, including autism. So this generation is being born into several generations of this building up. This is why we spend so much time focusing on the iron problem. And it starts with our water being a primary source of iron. For some of us who had got on the cast iron cookware bandwagon, okay, well, let's switch that around. My wife and her sister from Texas who were addicted to Topo Chico, Mexican carbonated spring water, high in iron. Both of them had reproductive issues, fibroids, and similar issues. So these all relate to the immune system and hormones and all the way back to iron. So iron accumulation in the tissues, when this is dysregulated, that's a defense mechanism. And one of the ways that our body responds to acute infections is by basically withholding iron to try to keep it away from the infections. Lactoferrin helps with that. But then hormonally, our bodies respond as part of the stress response is to pull minerals out of circulation where they're not going to be available. And this is why people who have adrenal issues and blood sugar problems tend to carry a lot of water weight. It's the body's trying to kind of dilute all of this stuff that it's hoarding that it can't hang on to. And this is a big part of why I, as a skinny fat person, could never drink enough water. And what I've seen for myself and many others as we go through this process and re-regulate all of these things is that we don't need much water. Drink some juice, drink some tea, drink some coffee, eat fruit, have a glass of water or two here or there, but nowhere near like it was in the past. And that's because of the relationship between iron, estrogen, histamines, and all of the stress hormones. Now this is where it bridges to calcium. So when we start creating this environment, this internal environment, one of the things that our body does to respond, like I said, is kind of accumulating minerals and metals in places where they shouldn't necessarily be. And one of those is calcium. So then we start to see calcification, and we start to see a decline in hormone D levels. And that is because calcium also plays a major role in chronic infection. So one of the papers that I linked to in the blog article about COVID-19 and calcium specifically shows one of many papers saying that calcium is the link between acute and chronic lung infection. So iron and calcium both fuel bacterial, fungal, and viral infections. Part of our defense mechanism would then be to reduce vitamin D production, which would stimulate the absorption of more calcium. So the body doesn't make mistakes. That's a way to protect us from the hypercalcification, hypercalcemia, that would make it harder for our body to fight chronic infections. So we don't want to mess with that. Vitamin D is a hormone, is a steroid. And just like any other steroid that is exogenous, so a steroid that is not produced by our body, when we take it internally, it is an immunosuppressive. And part of the function of D3, specifically the one that most people supplement with, and this is now very well established in the literature, is that it is immunosuppressive. It suppresses Th1 immune response, which is the one for fighting acute infection. And it upregulates Th2, which is the allergic type response. So it's creating an imbalance in our immune system. Now, for somebody who has autoimmune issues, this would feel good. Because Th1, when Th1 is too high, that's autoimmune. And just like you would treat autoimmune disorders with steroids very often, you can treat it with D3 at the expense of long-term immunity. So as the paper I linked to says, on the alternative hypothesis for vitamin D, is that we get a palliative effect in reducing discomfort of autoimmune symptoms at the long-term expense that we are prolonging the underlying infections that were creating the autoimmune condition in the first place. So all the years that I spent treating infections like chronic Lyme, Candida, Epstein-Barr, mold, you name it, were fundamentally wasted because they never properly addressed the underlying conditions that made it impossible for my own immune system to properly fight and get rid of infections. So we put the brakes on. About this time last year, this stuff was becoming more and more clear to me, and how we were incidentally addressing it with the old program was becoming more and more clear. And so it was a process to put this all into something cohesive and practical. And this is what we have now, because if we are going to address chronic systemic infections, we have to change the underlying conditions that make it impossible to get rid of those infections. Otherwise, all we're doing is practicing scorched earth, where we nuke the battlefield and hope that the enemy doesn't return. But the reality is that the enemy is not going anywhere. I had this realization one day just walking around in the woods. It was a very wet day for a walk, and I was like, mold is everywhere. How are you going to exist in a world that is literally dominated by mold, if your body cannot maintain differentiation from the mold that we're surrounded by. And that was a huge problem for me. When we had a black mold outbreak at our apartment 3.5 years ago, I thought I was going to die. It was devastating. And now, living in a very wet part of the world, the mountains of Western North Carolina, where I see a lot of people complaining about mold on a regular basis, that has no longer been a problem for me because I've addressed these underlying issues. Rob, did you have your hand up for a question?
Yes, just in terms of issues with fertility and things like that, you were mentioning issues with iron. In my wife's case, she had always been told that she was iron deficient.
Right.
So I'm not sure how that would connect with us having some of those same problems if she was not overfed iron.
So if the body is overcome with chronic infection, what is the defense mechanism? To withhold iron. Now, this does not necessarily mean you present as being sick. Chronic infections can be what are known as subclinical, where you don't have a cough, you don't have a sneeze, you don't have a fever, you don't have any of the diagnosable symptoms of infection, and yet we're constantly battling everything that's around us in the environment. There's trillions of viruses on our skin at every moment. And so if we are losing that battle, the body will go into these secondary and tertiary defense mechanisms, one of which is to withhold iron, which, yes, at the cost of not having adequate iron levels in your blood, which means you're going to feel a little bit sluggish. You're not going to have as optimal oxygen transportation through your system, and you're not going to have adequate iron for all of its other functions. But the body has decided that that was better than allowing that iron to be available for the infection. And then you go and you get tested at the doctor, and it looks like you're anemic. And so my wife, Rachel, her first pregnancy, same thing. They said, oh, you have, borderline anemia. And so we did what anybody would do, and we started loading her up with more iron. And then she got infections. First, she got a urinary tract infection while she was pregnant, and they had to put her on an antibiotic. After Mila was born, she developed mastitis. So those infections were present. And when we started loading her up with more iron, they blew up.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I'm
Sure.
not responding too much just because I'm with Iris, so her just all the time would be bad.
No, we don't mind the Q factor. But yeah, and so, knock on wood, a testament to, this process, this second pregnancy, no infections, no issues. Her fibroid did not expand. In fact, it shrank by about half, which the OB was struggling to explain. Well, maybe the way baby developed, it cut off circulation to the fibroid and it shrank, and like, okay, yeah, sure, that makes sense. Lisa's back. But yeah, this was our testing, our alpha beta testing to see exactly, okay, first pregnancy, we were doing quote unquote what everybody says was right to do, eating the way that we were supposed to be eating. And this time we were eating the way any healthy, quote unquote, healthy person in a Facebook group would tell us we're crazy. Eating sugar, gluten, dairy. And yet here we are. 9 months, no infections, no issues. Knock on wood, going to the hospital tomorrow and hopefully meeting our healthy new baby. So any other questions related to that? And then we're going to talk about just some of the things that we can do is once we've established a solid foundation in helping our body fix these issues. If we are dealing with chronic infections, what are the things that we can do to improve that?
Wow.
Sorry, you cut out. Oh.
Eric, can you go over how zinc affects the system again, the copper and the iron? Because I get how the copper helps remove the iron, but how does the zinc play into that triad again?
Yeah, so if you're supplementing zinc, it directly blocks absorption of iron and copper. And then if we are blocking copper uptake, that's going to obviously affect our iron metabolism. So even if we do absorb iron, we can't get it into the hemoglobin. We can't activate ferritin and the other peroxidase enzymes. And then if we're supplementing with a specific form of zinc and not just getting it from food in various forms that are organically bound minerals, that can directly affect the production of certain types of proteins that are necessary also for the transport of metals. So these enzymes are called metallothionein, and they're critical for transporting both the metals that we do want and the metals that we don't want. So you can start to see, oh, this is a big part of like why, whether it's lead poisoning or mercury or aluminum, right? All of these big buzzwordy heavy metal toxicities, how they can come around and how somebody who might think they're doing everything right could actually be creating the perfect conditions for everything to go wrong.
So is that like when you're having like fish, I guess fish and things that have a lot of maybe heavy metals that would exacerbate. And my question also is about, vaccines and things that have mercury and stuff in them. I mean, everyone is, I'm just getting so much flack from people that are telling me, oh, I gotta do this, I gotta take this vaccine. It's like, no, I wanna do my own research about what's actually, in these things, and no one, no one sees that. It's like they're all, no, I mean, you gotta work for the greater good. I mean, this organization is, and so it's,
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a lot of conflicting information. And I think that, the vast majority of people that get any vaccine are going to be fine. And then there's the percentage of people who are not fine. And it's not necessarily a vaccine, right? Because we just showed it could literally be because they're taking a multivitamin. Or because they're taking cod liver oil, right? Like all of these things that people have been doing, hitting themselves in the hand with a hammer and saying it hurts so good. And I would not have any specific fears myself to go and get a shot if that's what I had to do. I mean, I already had COVID at least twice, I'm pretty sure. And Johns Hopkins released a paper that said, yes, definitively T-cell immunity to COVID, it works on COVID and variants. So personally, I'm not worried. Now, if I was somebody who had to get it or was concerned or had, was caring for a mother who was very ill, cancer, partner with cancer, things like this, that might behoove me to get the shot, sure. Well, go ahead, because if you know that you're not putting yourselves in the condition of having a dysregulated immune system, that should not be a concern. So going back to the vitamin D thing, right? Suppressing Th1 and upregulating Th2, Th2 being the allergic immune response, and the primary problem that people are having as a response to this shot is anaphylactic response, allergic response. How many of those people having the anaphylactic response have either been supplementing with vitamin D or drinking vitamin D fortified dairy or eating total cereal with vitamin D added to it, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So it's always, I guess you always got to look at the whole picture of what's going on, because it's like two things they gotta mix together and can create a horrible condition. But it's not just one thing that's usually gonna.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why same thing with nutrition when we're trying to heal. We can't just look at how all these things interact. I mean, I for quite a while thought that supplementing with zinc was really critical to helping the body detoxify from retinoids. And I saw that certain people that worked well. Certain people, we saw these types of problems, major problems. And so, if something is not true one time out of 100, it's not true. So that's it. You have to take it off the table. Something that doesn't work. And so this is the paper that I linked, one of the papers that I linked to, Laura. So you can get this link in there too, but if you just search for this, comes up pretty quickly on Google Scholar. And it just very quickly summarizes exactly what's happening. So, zinc excess, where is it? Reduces the bioavailability of copper. And then what's interesting is that when we supplement, we can actually create zinc deficiency because you become dominant in one specific form of zinc. And that can affect protein synthesis. So the metallothionein. And while we're here, dairy gets such a bad rap, and it's so unjustified. So, we have proven this is what it does. This is part of our immune system, and that's why we evolved drinking dairy, and that's why cultures, civilizations that developed dairy ended up thriving and taking over the planet, because their immune systems were bolstered by that of the cow. And we look at the clinical significance. So lactoferrin's primary role is to sequester free iron and remove essential substrate for bacterial growth. Critical.
But this is in like good, wholesome milk without the vitamin D and not with the like bovine growth hormones and stuff like that. So normal.
Yeah, well,
cheap
yes,
milk.
there's good quality. Yeah, right. Because cheap milk is going to be adulterated. It's going to be fortified with vitamin A, vitamin D, right?
But that's what most people are drinking because it's cheap. Mm-hmm. They don't want to, and so then they
Yep.
So then they say, oh, milk is bad, when it's not actually the milk that's bad. It's the product that you're drinking.
Right. Right. Exactly. So they're blaming the milk for what's actually humans are doing to the milk.
Yeah.
And one of those things is feeding cows soy and corn, because that makes their milk more omega-6 rich. And so it ruins the benefits of the saturated fat as well. Right. And then look, antiviral. Okay. Now it's interesting is that
it all possible grass-fed milk, yogurt, cheese, right?
yeah, you definitely want to do your best to get grass-fed, and I think it's okay if the cow is grain finished, which most small farmers do. Like we get meat from a farmer here, he finishes, and he doesn't force them to eat the grain. He gets grain from a brewery, and he just makes it available to them in the last 90 days of their lives. And they eat grass, they eat some grain, they go back and forth, and it does fatten them up, creates more marbling, and makes the meat a little bit tastier, less gamey, and I think it's worthwhile. And then for the same thing for milk, if you drink straight grass-fed milk, it doesn't taste that good. It doesn't. It tastes a little bit gamier versus cows that are, they get to eat a little bit of oats and things that are obviously not. So I think there's a balance.
Always is a balance.
Yeah. And
Also-
this. Oh, I was just gonna say that this used to say coronavirus. It used to have.
Oh.
It used to have links to papers showing lactoferrin was effective against coronavirus. They took it out. Because I've been looking at this paper for a long time. At this article. And then, so they talk about SARS.
It's Wikipedia, so Wikipedia is always being, isn't it? It's open source, right?
Yeah, it's open source, but it's also moderated
And it's
to, So I don't know. I don't know. I'm not looking at anything nefarious there, because maybe they just didn't, they didn't want people to get confused or something. I don't know. But they say SARS here, but it literally it said coronavirus is here. A little over a year ago. But yes, antifungal, right? And so a big part of understanding this process too is that as we're fixing these issues, one of the things that people experience when they're doing other types of like candida cleanses or Lyme protocols is this thing they call die-off. And I think it's total baloney. There's no reason that when you're reducing the infection load in the body that you should feel worse. Because I think what they're actually doing is making the infection worse. And that's exactly what I experienced. And every time they would tell me, oh, it's die-off, I would say, oh, hooray.
I'm dying.
Keep going.
Not
Yeah. And what I'm seeing now is people going through this process, doing it in the right order. First eliminating the bloating in the gut, and then doing all of this other work. There's no die-off. There's just improvement. And look, anti-carcinogenic and cystic fibrosis, right? And not that cystic fibrosis itself is indicated in, worse outcomes with COVID, but what happens to the lungs, fibrin and scar tissue that develops during more, worse chronic infections is described as like being like cystic fibrosis. So there's an interesting connection there, and this is something I've started talking about, lipofuscin, where free iron, estrogen, polyunsaturated fat all kind of combine into this soup and create fibrin, which is kind of like plastic. And if it also links up with beta carotene, that becomes the dark pigmentation that happens on the skin in places that are more prone to sun exposure. So I see this on a lot, especially on a lot of like vegan influencers on their, you know, their Instagrams. They all have the dark speckling with white just here, on the bald spot, on the arms, chest. And that's exactly what that is. This is fibrosis, lacto, or whatever that word was.
What are you doing?
All right. Great. Any questions about this stuff? Cool. All right. So obviously step one is being on the program and addressing the dysregulation of iron and the calcification and dysregulation of the immune system and getting your stress hormones under control, which requires regulating your blood sugar. Was that a question? Oh.
I think someone's not muted.
Someone's talking to their kitty. And so once that is established, then the more benign doses of anti-infective stuff than we would have had to use otherwise to get these infections under control. So the ones that I have been finding universally beneficial, colloidal silver and oil of oregano, and sometimes the turpentine, that's still kicking butt. But instead of having to take a tablespoon of it, I'm finding getting better results now in this process with using just a few drops, especially using it in the sinuses and the neti pot or on the skin for infections there. Same thing with oregano oil for people with any sort of infections going on there. Instead of having to stress and pizza burps, we can get away with very little and get far more effect because we've taken away the mess, right? You know, we have to understand, right, is that what most people are doing out there in, you know, the health guru la la land is saying, hey, look at the mess in your kitchen. There's all these dirty dishes and you haven't taken the trash out. So let's nuke it with, you know, whatever magical anti-infective herb we've just discovered in, you know, in Bali on my last chocolate trip. And nobody ever stops to say, hey, maybe we should clean up this mess first. And then the cockroaches and the rats won't have any reason
to be there.
to stick around in this mess. The substrate, like just like the Wikipedia article says, we take away the substrate that fuels bacterial, fungal, and viral growth. And then you have a much weaker enemy. And in fact, a lot of these things, when they're in a proper balance and they're not overgrown and malignant, can be a beneficial part of our microbiome. So the goal is not to nuke everything. The goal is to get it back into balance.
Of course. Balance.
That's one of the things that we understand is that, you know, when, for example, when Candida becomes terminal patients, people who are dying and they're otherwise starving. Candida starts starving, and it starts sending out these filaments into the tissues and organs in the body. That's what is deadly. And the same thing happens if we go on a Candida cleanse and we cut off all carbs and sugar and think we're going to starve this yeast.
Mm.
And then then your practitioner or your Instagram guru says, "Oh, just die off. You'll be fine." And then that's pretty much it. If you're doing the program as well as you can, which doesn't even require 100% Krispy Kreme donut if you got your vaccine, you'll be fine. I don't recommend it. It's not key to the program. But if those things happen, whatever reason, because that is just what you have to do right now, you'll be fine. Just stick with the program, trust your body, get out of crisis, however you have to do that. If it requires medication, if it requires surgery, you do those things and you get your body back to a place where you can feel safe and comfortable, and then work with wherever you are. Cool. So we got 5 minutes. Any questions? Was that at all helpful? Did that clear things up? Was there any confusion from any of the materials that I provided that I could go back and make clearer?
Where is if I wanted to go over this, I guess, research and look over, the main parts of the program, where do I go for that?
Yeah. So in the
blog, or because other else did, website of the Mighty Networks and
in the
blog.
Mighty Network. Yep. And we just, so, I'm better articulating a lot of these concepts. So like we literally just posted an article about this here. So this goes much more into depth on it. Right. So drink your OJ and eat your dairy. Filter your water. Right. That's the foundation. And if anything else that we could do that could be effective would not be effective without the foundation. That's critical. And then on the blog, we have this article. Okay. And then this one talks about the calcium connection and chronic infection. So definitely take a moment, take some time to read through these. Be an expert in any of these topics, but it's definitely helpful to understand why you're doing what you're doing, especially if anybody's like, what? Your health practitioner says sugar is good for you?
Dairy is what?
Right? But dairy causes mucus. What do you mean that vitamin D isn't a magical panacea for COVID?
Yeah. All these things. And then iron. I mean, I should stop taking iron.
Yeah, it was funny because like I somebody sent me this the article from Cornell. 1.4 million cases they looked at. No connection between vitamin D status and outcome. $1.4 million people. It's hard to argue with that. So anybody out there, Zach Bush, whoever, saying, hey, you got to take your D so you don't die. I don't know, maybe he's trying to kill us.
Eric, I have a question.
Sure.
How do you know when you should be taking oregano oil or not? Like, what's the trigger for that, and then how long do you consider it?
Well, if you're having any symptoms that could look or feel like infection, if you have sinus congestion, a cough, anything like that, give it a try. If you're having like UTI symptoms, but so far, for the most part, except in the case when people come into the program with known acute infection, this has been a non-issue because the immune system is now properly functioning. And I had one woman who thought she had a UTI and ran to the doctor, got a antibiotic, started taking it, felt worse, called me. Stopped taking the antibiotic, overdoing it with the minerals, which is easy to do at the beginning. I think at least one other person here had a similar experience. And it's easy to do because when our body is still kind of just saturated and swollen with the minerals, and we do that, that can create kind of like extra pressure, and it feels like almost like a UTI. So then she stopped taking the minerals, and almost immediately problem went away, and that was that. And I'm seeing the same thing with people who, oh, I've been doing, IV antibiotics for my Lyme disease for 5 years, stuff like that. So for you, Laura, I mean, if you have any sneaking suspicions that oregano oil might be helpful, okay, get a bottle, take a capsule once, 3 times a day, see if you notice any sort of improvement or change. And if you do, great. That might be speeding up some of the process. And if not, great. You didn't need it. Mm-hmm. But there's no subjective way to know if you don't have acute signs of infection.
What's the best way of I mean, there's different forms of oregano and capsules and just oil in a bottle for different purposes.
You cut out at the beginning. Was the question like to just have them around?
No, I'm saying you mentioned taking capsules. I mean, I've always just taken oregano oil right and dropped it in kind of water and taken it that way. Or
yeah, that works. It works. It's just it just burns. It's not enjoyable.
Oh.
So yeah, I mean, I bought the bottle of liquid, and I was just putting it in empty capsules when I was taking it. And yeah, if you like when I thought I had COVID again back in February, everybody at Milo's school was like, "Oh man, I don't know what this is." Everybody's got a little cough and fever and headaches. I took some oregano oil, and I had symptoms for like a day and a half. And that was it. So yeah, it's a good thing to have around. Colloidal silver is a good thing to have around.
Yeah. No, and I guess I've talked to you before about this, but I've got this kind of fungus on my nails, and I guess you said take the you can do both, but brushing it on and
Yeah.
as well as taking it internally.
Yeah. So, you got to pick one or a combination, right? So all three of those would work internally and topically to help speed up healing that fungus. And as you're changing the underlying conditions, it's going to go away. I had chronic athlete's foot, and I didn't do anything to treat it. It just went away. So yeah, soak your feet, soak your toes. Put, you could mix a little bit of turpentine and oregano oil, and you wouldn't really be able to mix colloidal silver in there unless you bought one of like the gels or something like that. But you could do those two and just treat it topically. For skin stuff too, apple cider vinegar works great. You put in a spray bottle or soak the affected area.
And yeah, so you would put a little bit of the turpentine and oregano in some water and just soak in that.
Yeah, just put them on there. Sorry, you froze a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. It's doing that.
But yeah, just apply them.
Okay.
All right. Everyone feels good about that so far? Cool. All right, great. Well, that's why we're writing these articles and putting them on the blog. So if you know people that are struggling and doing things that we now know are very counterproductive,
And then there.
do them a favor. Share your experience and share the articles, and we can probably reduce a lot of unnecessary suffering in the world if we can just help people live more what's the word, more comfortably, more less in the extremes.
Naturally connected.
Bingo. All right, this video will be available for anybody that wants to go back and look at it again. Most of the stuff that I talked about though is also directly in those two articles, the one in the Mighty Network, and when I talk about it, iron and water in the course, and then on the blog. And hopefully you guys are experiencing the benefits. All right, well, let's call it a night. And then baby arrives tomorrow. I will be available intermittently if anybody has any pressing or urgent concerns and questions and things like that. And there will still be like automated posts in the Mighty Network and newsletter. And then you should see on your schedules, you should already see invites for the next group call. And then we'll send out an email for scheduling the next round of one-on-ones.
What time? And what time is your happy moment?
We're scheduled for noon. So taking wagers on whether it's a boy or a girl and what time.
What do you want?
Well, Rachel really wants a girl. I'm okay either way, but yes, it would be nice to have a boy and a girl.
Twins.
Yeah. Oh, whoa. Where did that come from?
You don't ever know. Could be. Could be.
Date of the official time of birth will be 12:43. 104.
And you already have a name picked out, I think, whether it's
Yes.
girl or boy.
Yeah, for a boy or a girl, Rachel wants to name the child Arlo.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it'll be Arlo Blaylock Levinson.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's like my brother's he's 50 something, and he just had celebrated her 2-year birthday, Frankie. So sounds
Oh,
like a
Frankie?
boy's name, but it's a girl, Frankie. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cute. I like that for a girl. So, all right, great. Well, if everybody is good on iron and calcium and the immune system, I will see you all soon. Have a great night.
You too. Enjoy.
Thanks, Eric. Good
Have
luck
fun.
tomorrow.
Thank you. Look for pictures.
Arlo.